Hey everybody, mel0n here. Welcome back to another episode of the mel0n Review. Today we're going to be wrapping up part 2 of my review of the esptiger Tang DAO SR. Now this was a rather unique pad to test, as the surfacing and the performance of this pad is unlike anything I've ever used before, so much so that the DAO SR has kind of made itself, for lack of a better word, incredibly niche, but a niche that it excels in. Now before we get into the review, I did want to say a big thank you to Potent Gaming for sending over the Tang DAO SR for me to review. Potent Gaming carries esptiger, X-Ray Pad, Glassworks, Sun, and many other brands on their site. They're also based out of Canada, so if you're a fellow Canadian looking for mouse pads, grade script tape, and you want to avoid paying the import fees from the United States, be sure to check them out. I'll have their website linked down in the video description. And lastly, if you enjoy the review and you want to see more reviews like this, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss any upcoming reviews. Alrighty, well let's go ahead and get right into it. First off, we're going to talk about how the Tang DAO SR performed in-game. Despite esptiger marketing this pad as a control pad, my experience with the DAO SR was completely different, leaning into that nicheness that I mentioned earlier. Now, if I had to classify how the DAO SR feels, to me it feels like a firm hybrid pad with an extremely high degree of initial friction and stopping power, but also having a surprisingly smooth glide, which is a very unique combination here for a pad. Because of that, the Tang DAO SR felt best in dynamic aiming games that had a heavy emphasis on control, so games like Valorant, Diabolical Rogue, and Overwatch 2 playing Cassidy specifically felt the best here on the Tang DAO SR. The pad is still usable for by dynamic tracking heavy games, but the pad shines in more fast-paced static flicking oriented games. Another interesting note here about the Tang DAO SR is that this pad is very firm. I'd probably say around the medium to hard softness, meaning that there isn't much, if any, control variability on the Tang DAO SR, so you won't be able to utilize any of the pad's quote-unquote softness to get some extra control. All of the control you're going to feel on this pad is going to be entirely dependent on the surface friction between the pad and the skates you are using. Now, this unique surface friction does give the Tang DAO SR a unique performance profile, but it does also have some issues with it when it comes to arm sleeve and bare arm usage, but I'll talk about that later in this video. Now, this unique surfacing is what makes the Tang DAO SR so unique, so let's talk about that next. Now, the surfacing here on the Tang DAO SR is this very pronounced Y-shaped weave that runs horizontally across the pad's surface. I did some research and tried to look around to find a pad with a similar surface stitching from my collection, but I wasn't able to find an exact match. The closest, I guess you could say, was the Fnatic 2, but they still differ significantly, but that was the closest analog to the Tang DAO SR. Now, the unique thing about the surfacing is that due to its raised design, it's very abrasive against anything that rubs against it, particularly skin. Similar to how the Vax EPA had that raised soft surface stitching, it's a similar situation here on the Tang DAO SR, just with significantly higher friction and more of an abrasive feeling to the hand. As I mentioned earlier, the control you're going to feel here on the Tang DAO SR is essentially completely dependent on the friction between the skates and the surface of the pad. Now, this does add some variance to the Tang DAO SR because depending on what kind of skate you're using, the pad is going to feel very, very different. Now, from my personal experience using dots and donuts here on the Tang DAO SR, I found the pad to be, as I mentioned earlier, surprisingly fast, but with significantly more emphasis on stopping power due to the high surface friction. Akin to the stopping power's initial friction or static friction is also very high on this pad due to the surfacing. Now, this surfacing is also very unique when it comes to X and Y performance. Now, based on this very tall Y-like surface stitching that runs across the X-axis of the pad, movements on the X-axis or horizontally across the pad will feel very fast, but once you start to deviate from the X-axis, you start to feel more feedback from the pad. Y-axis movements are the most resistant, and as you deviate closer to the X-axis, the resistance lessens. So this pad is highly optimized for more horizontal movements, which, as I mentioned before, makes this pad very good for static flicking games that have a high reliance on stopping power. Now, the pad is still usable for more dynamic aiming games, but the Y-axis resistance does hamper the performance, but it will heavily depend on how much into the Y-axis you move into. Now, as I talked about earlier, the Tang DAO SR is a very firm pad, meaning that there is little to no give to the surface, meaning there is going to be very little control variability here on the pad despite its 4mm thickness. Now, the surface does have a little bit of give to it if you put an exorbitant amount of pressure onto the mouse to push into the pad, but it's nothing you'd be able to utilize during normal use, as it would just be too heavy and your mouse will bottom out on the bottom of the pad. Now, this of course can be a downside for those who like to use the softness of a pad to get some more control, but considering that the surface of the Tang DAO SR is so high friction already, the control variability doesn't really seem like it's needed here. Another benefit of the hardness of this pad is that the Tang DAO SR is very, very compatible with a lot of different skates. Due to the harder surface here on the Tang DAO SR, this pad is compatible with pretty much every single kind of skate out there. I was able to use full-size stock skates, speed stocks, donut skates, and dot skates all perfectly fine here on the Tang DAO SR without any issues of these skates bottoming out. I will say there is one exception to this, where very, very small dot skates like the esptiger smaller sizes do have issues where they can just kind of bottom out pretty frequently because of their lower surface area. But realistically speaking, I don't think this is going to be a problem for anyone, because if you're going to use these very, very tiny ones, it's to use multiple of them at the same time. So realistically speaking, this isn't a problem problem, but very tiny dots will have some compatibility issues here, but those aren't very commonly used. But in terms of regular or normal size dot skates, donut skates, speed skates, and full-size stocks, they all worked flawlessly here on the Tang DAO SR. Another benefit of this raised Y-like surface stitching here on the Tang DAO SR is the effects of moisture. Now, pouring water on top of the surface of the pad, you can see that water beads at the top of the surface for a couple seconds and then slowly starts draining into the pad. This is very similar to how the Zowie GSR2 handles moisture, however, it's just a little slower in terms of draining here on the Tang DAO SR. Now, because the water drains into the pad, this means that the surface layer of the pad is going to be largely unaffected by moisture. If there is an impact, it is very minimal. So the Tang DAO SR is very well suited for a higher humidity environment as the surface is widely resistant to it. Again, if it's like a crazy amount of moisture, you may notice a little more variance in the performance than I did, but from my testing thoroughly soaking the pad, there wasn't a significant difference in the performance. Alright, now in terms of build quality and QC, the Tang DAO SR is actually one of the best made and best QC'd pads I've actually seen in a very long time. There is no issues with any loose stitching anywhere across the pad, even on the surface stitching and the edge stitching. Nothing is loose. The surface stitching is consistent across the entire pad. The base is consistent. Everything is just extremely well QC, which is very impressive. Given the price of this pad, I was expecting QC to be a bit of an iffy area, but this pad is made to the quality of pads that are triple its price, which is very impressive. So props to esptiger there. They've done a really good job. The build quality and QC here on the Tang DAO SR is perfect. Alrighty, next up, let's talk about the base here on the Tang DAO SR. Now, the base here is an SCR rubber base that has that soft-ish rubber feel to it, but it is a firmer base because the rest of the pad is quite firm. It's not sticky to the hand like a pour-on base is or the base we found on the Infinity Mice pads, so it lacks that kind of self-adhesion, and without downward pressure forcing the pad against the surface of your desk, it can't move very easily, but as long as there's an arm or some form of downward force on the pad anchors itself pretty well. Personally speaking, I do think the base is the weakest part of this pad. It would have been nice to see maybe a stickier rubber base here instead of this softer rubber base. Overall, the implementation is quite weak, and that is the weakest part of this pad in my opinion. Alright, next up, let's talk about the edge stitching here. Now, the edge stitching on the Tang DAO SR is very well implemented. As I mentioned earlier in the build quality and QC, there are no problems with the edge stitching. It is incredibly well manufactured. The edge stitching is rounded and is sit just below the surface of the pad. It also appears to be made of the same material that the surface is made of, but it's significantly less abrasive against the skin. So it's actually surprisingly easy if you move your arm across the side of the edge stitching, which is a really nice attention to detail. Overall, a very solid implementation. It reminds me a lot of these edge stitching we saw on the Infinity Mice pads for some reason, maybe because they're a similar thickness, but the implementation here on the Tang DAO SR is very good. Now, next up, let's talk about arm sleeve compatibility. Now, this is one area where the Tang DAO SR does have a lot of struggles. Now, from my experience, using a bare arm on the Tang DAO SR is usable, but it is extremely high friction, higher than any other pad I've tested. Now, because the surface friction was so abrasive against my arm and so slow, I went to go try some arm sleeves, but unfortunately, arm sleeves are even worse, where the surface friction is just so high friction, it just eats away at the arm sleeve, and it is extremely high friction. So the only kind of arm sleeve you're going to be able to use here on the Tang DAO SR is like a lizard skin sleeve where there's PTFE on the bottom of the sleeve. That is going to be the only way you're going to use a sleeve on this pad. And unfortunately, if you don't have one of those sleeves, you're stuck using your bare arm, which is a pretty poor experience as well, just because it is so high friction. I actually ended up using the Delta Hub Carpios to kind of brace my arm off the surface of the pad, which should make the pad significantly more easier and definitely cut down on that roughness, abrasiveness feeling on my skin, but it is still less than ideal. So while the surfacing of the pad does have a lot of uniqueness in terms of performance, it is just unusable with arm sleeves, and it is very abrasive against arms. If you're someone who has a floated grip, this won't necessarily be a problem, but if you are someone who's a little sensitive to very abrasive materials, I'd stay clear of the Tang DAO SR because it is very abrasive against skin. Alrighty, and lastly, I wanted to talk about the effects of cat hair and dust. Now, over my testing, I found that for the most part, despite the raised surface and very abrasive surfacing, the pad is largely resistant to pet hair, or at least I haven't noticed any that are stuck in the pad or anything that affected the performance. However, dust is a bit of an issue on this pad, similar to what we saw with the Infinity Mice Ruin, where dust is going to fill up those small little gaps in the surface stitching. It's going to slow down over time. Also, keep in mind, because this pad is not usable with arm sleeves, people are going to use their bare arm on this, which means that dead skin and oils from your skin is going to fill up the pad very quickly. So this is a pad you are most likely going to have to clean pretty frequently just due to the buildup of dead skin, just due to the highly abrasive surface. So if you do end up getting a Tang DAO SR, just keep an eye on the performance. If you notice any areas are getting slow or you're having any areas mistracking, I'd recommend washing the pad. That should restore the pad to its regular performance. Alrighty, well, in closing, the esptiger Tang DAO SR is a very interesting mouse pad. It's very niche and it excels at static flicking performance on the horizontal axis, but it's not very well optimized for other aiming tasks due to the heavy difference in the resistance on the X and Y axis due to this Y-like stitching, combined with the weaker base implementation and the extremely high friction surface being incompatible with arm sleeves and extremely abrasive against bare skin. So in its current iteration, it's very difficult for me to recommend the Tang DAO SR. Again, this pad is good at one thing. It is exceptionally good at static and flicking performance on the X or horizontal axis. This pad is just incredibly mediocre at every other aiming type, so more dynamic tracking and this weird range of resistance on the Y axis just makes this pad incredibly hard for me to recommend. If you do want to learn more about the Tang DAO SR, I will have product links down in the video description for you. But that's everything for today's episode of the mel0n review. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you again to Potent Gaming, who was kind enough to send over the Tang DAO SR for review. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more reviews like this on the channel, be sure to drop a like and get subscribed to the channel. If you'd like to directly support the channel, you can become a member here on YouTube. It is only $2 Canadian per month, and it is the best way to directly support the channel. You can also help support the channel by using code mel0n at MetKeys, Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming Gear, TJ Exclusives, and a couple other retailers. But that is everything from my review of the esptiger Tang DAO SR. Thank you very much again for watching, and I will catch you guys all in the next episode of the mel0n review. Peace.